Well, tonight I'm going to visit with y'all about considerations for backyard animal farming, or maybe one way to look at it would be calling it the backyard chicken farmer, or one other way to look at it would be the confessions of a closet chicken farmer, which would be myself. Do want to visit with y'all a little bit about some considerations to think about in small space farming of livestock. So we're going to talk about chickens and rabbits specifically tonight. Granted that there are other small species that you could raise in a confined area like goats and sheep, but tonight we're going to concentrate on chickens and rabbits because they've got some attributes that really lend themselves well to food security type issues. So what we're going to do first, we're going to start off with talking about chickens. You have to have some goals, just like we've mentioned before tonight. We want to make sure that you've got some goals on what is realistic and what are your expectations of the chicken enterprise that you're going to have. So do you want to raise chickens for eggs or meat, or do you want a dual purpose bird so that way you can harvest some eggs but also be able to get meat carcasses out of these chickens? With that in mind, you need to think about the different breeds that are available that are out there. The Rhode Island Reds are a good bird that produces a lot of eggs, as are the Leghorn or the white leghorns, but the white leghorns are a little bit meatier bird as well, so they work well as a dual purpose animal for you in that backyard consideration. Now this slide's pretty busy, and I don't want you to try to digest all of it right now, but what I want you to consider is not just the breeds up here, because there's probably 4 times more breeds than are listed on this slide, but what I thought was really interesting about the way that they had this graphic set up is the different attributes down here that you need to think about for your birds. So the first thing you want to think about is, what kind of egg do I want to produce? Do I want to produce that brown egg, or do I want a white egg, or do I want even a green egg, or does it even matter to you? Or is it all about quantity? Do you want a bird that's average or above average, or as they put in this slide, an unbelievable amount of egg production? But if you're also in that dual purpose, or you want the meat from those birds, then you need to think about the meat production. In our area, we also have to think about heat tolerance and cold tolerance, because we have both extremes. Just recently, we've had a lot of really cold temperatures, and you need to make sure that you have a bird that can be able to withstand those cold temperatures without a lot of additional effort or work on your part, other than providing them good quality housing to be in. Then on the flip side, during the summertime, if you want those birds to continue to produce eggs for you, as well as continue to produce good meat quality for you and ample meat, you need to make sure that they're heat tolerant as well. Some birds are predisposed to being a little more heat tolerant than others, and so that's something you need to think about. Also, if you're going to free range your birds, how good are they at foraging, which means going out and earning their living on their own without having to do it through a feed bag. So if you're free ranging them, you may want to make sure that you're finding a bird that's excellent. Another really important trait here is broodiness. And what that means, broodiness, is basically the hen's predisposition to wanting to start to hatch out a clutch of eggs. Certain breeds of chickens are a lot more prone to that. And if you leave eggs in there, say you go out of town for the weekend, nobody's picking up the eggs out of the nest boxes. If you have a broody breed, you might come home to find a hen already sitting on those eggs. Of course, you can just remove those eggs, but once she becomes broody, it's real hard to get her out of that habit because that motherly instinct has kicked in, and she's going to try to want to get sitting on any eggs that any of the other hens will lay in those nest boxes. So really think about that. Some people think about the personality. Do you want a hen that's really flighty, or do you want one that's real docile? My personal experience is I like having a hen that has a little flightiness traits to her. And the reason is because if she's a little flighty, I think she seems to last a little bit better in our environment. And what I mean by that is we've got predation. We've had our hens, my wife and I have had hens that have been attacked by the neighbor's dogs, by raccoons, by skunks, by just about any wildlife animal you can possibly think of. And then, of course, their eggs being eaten. So think about the personality. A really docile hen is going to be less flighty, so she's probably going to need to be kept in an enclosed area rather than allowing her to forage. Because she just doesn't really have the instinct, I think, is what it is. She doesn't have that instinct to be able to recognize danger and to be able to react to it and get away from it, where a flighty bird anything that reacts to them is going to cause them to go ahead and flee the situation. One other thing to think about, typically, the more docile the birds, typically the better egg producers they are. So what about a rooster? You know, everybody seems to think if I've got hens, I've got to have a rooster. Do you need one? Well, old Foghorn Leghorn here, he would say you've got to have a rooster in your hen house, because if you don't, your hens aren't going to do anything. Well, that's not true. If I'm in the business, or if I want to lay my hens to lay eggs just for food consumption, or if I want to have just meat consumption and I want to buy chicks and then raise them up and I don't want to hatch anything out, you don't need a rooster in the situation. Also, if you live in town, which many of y'all do, then you have ordinances that come into play. Your neighbors may not want to be woken up at first light with the crow of a rooster. So a lot of cities will allow you to have hens in the city in the confined areas, but they will not allow you to have roosters because of the fact they're going to wake everybody up early in the morning. So think about what your goals are and whether or not you need a rooster. If you're going to hatch them out, then of course you need that rooster to be able to fertilize those eggs so that you have viable eggs to be able to hatch out. If you are going to go and hatch out a set of chicks, this is something you need to think about. What kind of incubator do you want to have? Incubators can be anything from as simple as this type of incubator here, which is real common to see in what I'm going to call the big box farm stores. Those are the ones that are located just about in every town. You can find these incubators for anywhere from around $50 to $70, $75. They're real easy to use. Main thing that there's a few components in those. You have to make sure you keep the humidity correct, and you have to make sure you have the temperature adjusted to the right settings. I'm not going to get in real detail of what those are, because we can spend an entire hour just talking about the processes that we need to do to incubate and hatch out chicks successfully. Remember, today I'm just covering a 30,000 foot elevation of things to consider. One thing I will say though, if you're going to incubate out some chicks and some eggs, go ahead and spend a little extra money to get an egg turner. What this is, it's an automated machine that sits in the bottom of those trays, and you set the eggs on it and it will slowly move those eggs back and forth. This simulates the natural process of a hen getting in and out of the nest box and moving those eggs around. So what this does is it helps increase the viability of the eggs and increase the percent of hatchlings that you're going to have. Now you can go a lot further and more in depth and detailed on incubators. You could spend the sky's the limit. They make cabinet style incubators where you can literally put hundreds of eggs in there at a time, and it has a small dryer or brooder area at the bottom, so as the chicks hatch you can leave them in there. Which brings it to another point. When the chicks hatch out of the eggs, a lot of people, their first instinct is let's get him out of there because he's hungry and he's thirsty. Well, I would say no. You want to leave that chick in that incubator for at least 24 to maybe 48 hours. The reason is that we want to do that is, you see in this photograph here, this chick's feathers are matted together. They're still wet from all the amniotic fluid that was inside the egg he was nourishing on while he was incubating. If we take this chick out right now, the survivability is going to be extremely low because he's still wet, he's cold, and his body hasn't fully come to the realization that he's outside of that protective shell of that egg. So leave him in there for 24 to 48 hours. He still has enough nutrients in his body from all the amniotic fluid and the yolk to be able to sustain himself while he's in that process. But make sure you do leave him in there. Once you take them out, you need to move them to a brooder. And what a brooder is that's just the next sit. It's like a big giant nursery, I guess you could say, or a heavily populated nursery. And what you want to make sure, some considerations on it, is make sure your sides are tall enough that as these chicks start to develop flight wings or flight feathers, they're going to try them out, and you don't want them jumping out and escaping. If your sides aren't tall enough, then make sure you put at least a chicken wire top or some sort of top over them, but make sure that airflow and ventilation is not hampered by anything you put over them. Also, you need to make sure you have a light as a heat source above those chicks, because they don't have a good ability to insulate themselves or keep themselves warm, and it's extremely vital for that early on first few days of that chick's life or first few weeks of that chick's life that we help them with supplemental heat sources. Make sure that you've got food and water, and I always like to space my food and water across the brooder, so that way it makes those chicks get out and exercise a little bit so that they can develop those leg muscles and become good, strong chickens in the future. Now, one other consideration in that brooder, avoid the temptation of putting the light too close. If you put that light too close to these chicks, you're actually going to overheat those chicks and you're going to have a bunch that are going to die. The other thing I always tell people is make sure that you put that light source in an area of that brooder where if the chicks start to get overheated, that they can move away and get away from that heat. So that way, if they want to, they can come back into the heat area or they can move away from it. But make sure you do supply that heat lamp to them, but not so close that you're going to cook those little babies. Now, once we get those chicks raised up and we're ready to move them out into the environment, you need some sort of chicken coop or a pen to put them in, as well as a place for those chickens, I should say, to have as a nest box. So this is for a backyard situation. This is a real common setup. Basically, it's just a small chicken house, or if you put tires on it, make it easy to move them one end, then we'd call this a chicken tractor. The advantages to this is you can go and buy these already pre-made. They're not cheap. A system set up like this is going to be in the hundreds of dollars, probably $400 to $500. But the advantage is you can move this house around your backyard, and that way every day that you move it, there's fresh grass down here for the chickens to be able to forage on, and that way they're not eating quite so much feed, and they're also getting some natural foraging and supplementation there. The way this is set up, there's a little ramp here in the back that goes up to where the nest boxes are, and also where the nesting rails are for the chickens to be able to get in to nest at night. Now, I prefer that if you're going to own chickens, that you give them some sort of area to exercise and to be able to run, so to speak. So I do like to have a chicken yard or chicken run here. This is a good example one that's out in somebody's backyard in town. As you can see, there's a privacy fence there. This allows those chickens to be able to have some room to exercise naturally. One thing to consider though is I'm a tall guy. If I have to crawl in here very often to get to the feed and water, that's not very tall. That's about 4 foot. I'm going to have to stoop down, and it's not going to be very enjoyable for me to do that. So I would suggest make this tall enough where you can get in there and move around easily enough. One thing though, reason that they have this shorter, is the taller you make that chicken run, then the more opportunity for a chicken to take flight, and if they crash into this top, they might potentially injure themselves or kill themselves by breaking their neck. So there's a happy medium on the height that you want this chicken run to be in. But I do like to have some area in there for them to move around, as well as make it easy for me to get in there when I want to clean that run or to put feed and water in there. Now this is an example of a really inexpensive chicken run or a chicken coop. They made a little frame that encases the bottom. And then you can see right here, they used a cattle panel wire. So 16-foot long, heavy gauge cattle panels. They bowed it and attached it to either side of the frame. After they did that, then they put the lightweight net chicken wire over that to make it where the chickens would stay in, as well as keep predators out. Then finally, on one end of it, they took just a blue poly tarp and they stretched that over one end to provide those chickens with some shelter. So you could put this together fairly inexpensively and fairly easily. Probably in an afternoon, you could be able to make that build that system, and probably be able to do it for under $100. So for somebody that wants to, they're not sure if they want to invest a lot of time or money into their chicken enterprise, this might be a good way to test the waters to see if this is something that you really want to get into in a bigger fashion or a more expensive way. This is an example of somebody who took an old hay wagon, set of running gear, and then he built a chicken house up on top of that. This way he can take it and he can move this around his property. And then if you look here in the background, you see there's a fence that encloses these chickens. This allows those chickens to be able to free range over a bigger area. Now, one thing I want to draw your attention to is this fence is held up with just plastic stays or plastic posts, and this entire fence is electrified. So we have a net wire electric system that we power by a solar charger, so that way the chickens learn to respect that fence, stay inside of it, but more importantly, we keep neighbors' dogs, coyotes, and other predators away from our hens if we're going to have them out in a free-ranging situation. This is just a close-up photograph of what it looks like. You can see The squares are rather small, and it's easy and very portable, as this lady's demonstrating that she can move it out by herself and set it up really rapidly. Now, this is a photograph, the best photograph I could find, but I really like it because what it demonstrates is if you want to have multiple species in a small footprint, land footprint, especially if you have a small yard in town, you have a limited amount of space and you want to do the most you possibly can with it. Well, this is a great way to do this. They've got rabbits up here in the hutches up on top, and the chickens are allowed to free range down underneath them. So what this does is the chickens take some benefit of the rabbit droppings and some of the feed that the rabbits scratch out and drop on the ground. The chickens will benefit from that. They'll turn it into something that's usable for us in the form of eggs or of meat, and we can do it all in the same footprint. So we're not having to have a separate area just for the rabbits or a separate area just for the chickens. So this system works out really well, especially if you got a small backyard you need to work with. Now we're going to talk just a little bit about different kinds of feeds, because again, this getting into the feeding of chickens or feeding the rabbits can be a multiple hour lecture on its own. But what I want to draw your attention to is there's several different forms or types that feed comes in, and it's extremely important that you match that with the right stage that the chick is. So when we first hatch out that chick and we've got them in that brooder and they're very small, think about the size of their beaks and think about the size of their esophagus and the crop and their stomach. They can't handle a big pellet like this. So we want to get feed that's in a mash form like this, so it's very finely ground. You can see some of the feed components. There's some corn shells there, as well as the rest of the different feed components that's been ground up real finely. Makes it easy for those chicks to be able to ingest it, and that way they get on feed faster, and the faster they get on feed, the healthier they're going to be, and the probability that they're going to survive and become full-grown chicks or chickens for you is higher. Once they get past this stage and they can handle a little bit larger, so we're in a developer stage now, we can move to these crumbles. And basically what those crumbles are, it's basically like a pellet, so it makes it a little easier for those mid-sized, those juvenile birds to be able to eat those pellets. And then when we move on and get into a mature chicken, especially if we're in a layer situation, the pellets work real well because you can buy layer pellets that are fortified with vitamins and minerals. They have a proper energy and protein balance already put together by a nutritionist. So this is a complete feed for your laying hens. Now, this is just another slide that shows some of the different options you have. And one option I didn't have on that previous slide was chicken scratch. And what chicken scratch is, it's just going to be different grains combined. So it's going to be things like sorghum, milo, corn, maybe some wheat, maybe some oats, all combined together into just a total mix. Well, here's a chick starter that's medicated, and I do recommend that you have a medicated chick starter. It increases the success that you will have with raising those chicks and getting them up into the juvenile stage. Once you get them into the juvenile or the grower stage, then you can use that crumble, and it doesn't necessarily need to be medicated at that point in time. And then of course we'll get into the layer pellets, or the other option is to chicken scratch. If I'm just growing chickens out, or if I've got an enterprise where I'm looking for a meat enterprise, I can use chicken scratch and get along just fine with that. If you do this, you probably want to make sure that you provide some oyster shell or some granite. They need something that's called grit, because grit, what they'll do is they'll eat that little bit of grit. It goes into the crop, and the crop is where the chickens actually break up those feed particles into smaller and smaller feed particles so that it can be digested and passed to the stomach. Think about it, chickens don't have teeth. So they have to have some way to be able to grind up that feed, and they do it in an organ that's called the crop, and to do that they need to be able to have that grit in the form of either something like a granite grit or some sort of real fine gravel, or commercially available oyster shells work really well. So let's move and talk about nesting boxes, because I don't know anybody, in my family at least, that we all love eggs, so we want to make sure we have a good, suitable, safe place that's inviting for the chickens to lay their eggs in. Because if I let our chickens free range at our house, and if I don't have an inviting, welcoming, suitable site for our chickens to lay their eggs at, they'll go find one out somewhere else. And that has happened in the past when we haven't kept our nesting boxes in good condition. And I'll come along and I'll find an area where I might find 15 or 20 or 30 eggs where the chickens have started laying the eggs instead of coming back to the nest box. but usually just make sure they're good and clean, make sure that they've got good airflow around them. But it doesn't have to be fancy. This is an example of somebody just used a little bit of lumber that they had left over from building the chicken house and built this 8-station nest box. One thing to note, on most nest boxes, you'll see that there's an angled top. This will prevent those chickens from getting up there and trying to roost, and that way it keeps it clean. If you had this as a squared off top, chickens are going to get up there, they're going to roost, they're going to defecate, and it won't take long, and you're going to have a pretty thick layer of chicken excrement on the top that you're going to have to continually clean off. This was when I was looking on the internet for different types of nest boxes. Really, the imagination is the limit of what really makes a nest box. As long as, like I said, you can clean it easy, you have good airflow, it's a safe environment for the hens, and it's inviting, it can be anything. So I really like this. Somebody took just looks like a crude shelving unit that they made, and then they used Tupperware tubs that they slipped into each of these areas, and there's a bungee cord that goes around and wraps around all 4 of those to hold them in place. So really inexpensive. The perches here are just tree limbs that they cut off. So I guess in a way you could say it's a little bit more natural, inviting feel with those tree limbs of being an actual tree limb rather than a manufactured log there or a manufactured pole. But this is something that works out real well. This is what I've got, what we transitioned to, which is a commercially available nest box. Some of the advantages to it is that you've got a little bit bigger perches here. The floors of each nest box are removable, so that makes it really easy to clean. And remember, we've got to keep these nest boxes clean, otherwise the hens will refuse to use them in the long run. One of the disadvantages is this system's a lot more expensive than what I've already showed you. I thought this was really neat. As I said, when I was looking at different nest boxes on the internet, I came across this where somebody just took 5-gallon buckets, cut the lids in half, screwed them back on so they wouldn't come off, and then made a pyramid out of them. So really, as I said earlier, the sky's the limit on what your imagination provides for you for those nest boxes. But that's something that's really easy to make, very cheap. If you know many farmers, you can probably get a good supply of 5-gallon buckets with no problem. Now let's talk about, shift gears, and let's talk about heat sources. We already mentioned it a little bit, but what I want to talk about in this situation is we want to make sure we have the proper heat lamps available to those chickens. In the background right here, you can just barely see, but we see that they're using just a clamp-on style heat lamp that you buy at the local store. I'm not a big fan of these. They're not designed to run 24 hours a day, and they're not designed to run in an environment that chickens are going to be in, where it's going to be dusty and there's going to be other potential chances of a chicken flying up and hitting it. To me, these are fire hazards, especially when you screw in one of those red infrared heat lamps into those fixtures. Instead, something that's a lot safer and better to use and built for the purpose, you can go to many of the chicken supply or the nursery vendors online to find these and to be able to buy them. They're going to be a little more expensive than those clip-on style heat lamps, but the safety factor involved with that is worth it. You don't have to worry about burning down the chicken coop or your backyard in that process. And I mentioned it already, but let's talk about predators. And in this photograph here, we can see that old foghorn leghorn's getting drug off by that old chicken hawk. I have seen hawks in our area that have actually dive bombed our chickens, but thankfully our chickens were mature hens and a little bit bigger than what those hawks could get at. But this is just some photographs of some of the different types of predators that my wife and I have had actual experience with. Snakes, they love chicken eggs. That's a continual battle if you own chickens, is every now and then you'll find a snake in the chicken house and trying to eat the eggs. But we've also had predation due to neighbors' dogs, to coyotes, foxes, raccoons of all things. They love chicken eggs, but also I've lost quite a few chickens to mature raccoons. They can be pretty nasty, vile little critters and make a really big mess out of a group of chickens. But also skunks. So just about anything in wildlife that you can think of that will predate or eat meat can be a predator towards your chickens. So you need to make sure you provide them with a safe place to be. Let's talk about a few production cycle parameters that we need to think about. It takes 21 days to hatch out a set of eggs. Once they're hatched, if we want fryer chickens, so that's a less than 5-pound carcass, it's going to take those chickens about 10 weeks to reach that size to have fryers. If we want broilers, so a little bit bigger carcass, over 5 pounds, it's going to take them 3 to 5 months to reach that age or that size of carcass for you. Typically, depending on the breed, layers are going to start laying between 6 and 8 months of age. The larger the breed is, or the larger the bird, the later the maturing is going to be. Also think about it. If they come to age during the winter or during the middle of the winter months, they're probably not going to start laying for you. Chickens are photosensitive, and what that means is they have to have enough daylight hours or exposure to supplemental light for their pituitary gland to tell them that it's okay to lay eggs. This was a natural survival mechanism from when chickens were wild animals out in the wild. So if you want chickens to produce eggs year-round, then during the winter months, especially in our part of the environment, you're going to have to supply them with supplemental light. Chickens need about 12 to 14 hours of light every day for them to be in a laying mode. So again, if they come to that 6 to 8 months of age during the middle of winter, and they're not laying for you, and you're not supplying supplemental light, don't be discouraged. That's just nature's own course. So remember, ultimately, this is our end goal. We want to be able to provide a chicken that we can use for food. Now, one thing about it, I'm going to say this young lady is probably going to have a hard time butchering that chicken because it looks like she might have that chicken named. You know, it's okay to have a few of them named, but try not to name all of them because otherwise you'll get attached and you're not going to be able to eat them.